The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, coloring the quiet bedroom neighborhood with golden and pink hues. The street was so quiet that even the light rustling of leaves seemed loud. In this tranquility, no one expected to see the ominous figure of a patrol car, which, like a predator, suddenly appeared on the corner and froze in front of a modest house. A little girl sat on the porch. Her hands rested on the armrests of her wheelchair, and her gaze was fixed on the neighbor's cat slowly wandering across the lawn. Her quiet smile seemed to reflect peacefulness, but this idyll was cruelly interrupted. A loud squeal of brakes cut through the evening air. The girl shuddered, her fingers involuntarily clutching the wheelchair's handrails as the door of the police car swung open. A man got out of the car. Tall, with a sullenly shrunken face, he cast a quick glance at the license plate and headed straight for the girl. His steps were sharp, almost threatening, as if he knew that in this place no one would dare to oppose him. The girl, feeling his hard gaze on her, immediately realized that he had come for a reason. The policeman stopped a few steps away from her. His eyes were full of contempt. There was a tension in the air, and even the wind was still, not daring to break the silence. The man leaned forward, staring defiantly into her face. "What are you doing here?" He gritted his teeth. His voice was low, filled with barely concealed anger. The girl, not understanding what was wrong, tried to say something, but her voice shook. I'm just waiting for my mom," she said faintly. That answer was not enough. The policeman straightened up roughly, his hand resting involuntarily on his holster, as if even the most innocent explanation were a challenge to him. "People like you shouldn't be stuck here. This neighborhood is not for you," he said sharply. His words, soaked with venom, sounded so loud that several neighbors looked out of their windows, but no one dared to intervene. The girl froze. Her eyes widened with fear, but she continued to hold on to the wheelchair's handrail as if it would protect her. "I didn't do anything wrong." She tried to object, but her voice trailed off. At that moment, the man stepped forward and, without taking his eyes off the girl, grasped the gun. His fingers slowly wrapped around the grip, and the tension reached a climax. There was dead silence in the street, only the pounding of the girl's heart, which seemed louder than anything else around. Her world, which had been so peaceful just a few minutes ago, began to crumble. All she could see was the cold metal of a weapon pointed directly at her and the face of a man who was enjoying his power. And no one had yet guessed that this evening would be the beginning of something much bigger. The uniformed man moved toward the girl with confident, even menacing steps. His dark uniform seemed to absorb the light of the evening sun, and his heavy boots left muffled thumps on the sidewalk, each one sounding like a hammer blow to the girl. She instinctively pressed herself into the back of her wheelchair, feeling a lump of fear rising in her throat. His eyes, full of contempt, slid over her face, then lingered on the wheelchair, as if her presence disgusted him. He stopped right in front of her, so close that she could smell his tobacco and sweat. "Don't you get it?" His voice cut through the silence like a knife. I said, "What are you doing here?" The girl, barely holding back her tears, mumbled, "I'm just waiting for my mom." The man grinned, but there was nothing friendly about that grin. It was more like a predatory grin. He looked down at her, as if she were something less than human. "Are you waiting for your mom?" he asked with a sneer. "Is mom like you, too? Sitting at home, waiting to be fed?" His words were filled with venom, each phrase humiliating her to the core. She looked away, but he stepped forward roughly and leaned in so that their eyes met. "Look at me when I'm talking," he said in a low, threatening voice. "There's no room in this neighborhood for people like you. What do you think this is, an amusement park? Who let you in here anyway?" The girl clutched the armrests of the wheelchair, her fingers white with tension. She tried to find words to justify herself, but her tongue felt like it was stuck to her palate. The man leaned closer, his shadow completely blocking her from the sunlight. "No one cares about your problems, okay?" He continued, looking straight into her eyes. "I see people like you every day. Whiners, beggars. You think because you're in that wheelchair, you can do anything?" Every word hit her like a whip. She tried not to cry, but the tears came traitorously to her eyes. The neighbors who looked out of the windows were watching, but no one dared to intervene. "It's a misunderstanding," she whispered, hoping her voice sounded firm. "I didn't do anything wrong." But her weak resistance only encouraged him. The man pushed the wheelchair roughly, causing its wheels to move backward slightly. She cried out, feeling her body jerk at the sudden movement. "You dare to argue with me?" he said, fury in his voice. "Remember, I make the law here, and if I say you're not here, then you are." He pulled out a notebook and started writing something down, but it was just an act of pressure. He threw such glances at her that were full of hatred. The girl realized that he was doing it not out of a sense of duty, but out of a desire to humiliate her, to show his superiority. "You know what the funny thing is?" he suddenly said, raising his head. "If you just disappeared, no one would even notice. There are always too many like you." Her breathing quickened, and tears were already rolling down her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but fear held her back. She couldn't even believe that this was happening, that the man who should be protecting her was unleashing his hatred on her. The man, seeing her tears, only grinned. He seemed to enjoy her humiliation. He slowly put the notebook away and straightened up, still looking down at her. "Remember, girl," he said, his voice sounding like a sentence, "in this world, the strong survive, and you are the weak." He took a step back, but his hand was back on the holster, a reminder that the power was in his hands. He stood for a moment, savoring his victory while her world crumbled under the weight of his words and actions. This meeting had already left a deep mark on her soul, but the girl didn't know that her mother was already running to the door, ready to be a shield for her daughter. And this officer had no idea what kind of game he had just gotten himself into. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. We want to know your thoughts and experiences. If you're curious about what's next, subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. The air around them seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and suffocating. The policeman took another step forward, and now his massive figure completely covered the girl sitting in her wheelchair. The sunlight that had recently warmed her face was extinguished in the shadow of this man, and her heart began to pound so loudly that it seemed to be audible even to him. The girl tried to explain again. I'm just waiting for my mom. She'll be here soon." But her voice grew weaker and weaker, her words drowned in his scornful gaze. He raised his hand sharply, silencing her, and leaned in close enough that she could see every crease in his frowning face. His breathing was heavy, as if the very fact that she existed pissed him off. "Shut up," he shouted, blocking all her attempts to speak. "I said there's no place for people like you here." His hand dropped to his holster, and she noticed it. The movement was slow, almost deliberately demonstrative, as if he wanted her to see every moment. His fingers gingerly touched the grip of the gun, and he lifted it slightly from the holster so that the black metal glinted in the sun. The girl involuntarily held her breath, her eyes widening with fear. The policeman smiled. That smile wasn't warm or reassuring. It was the grin of a predator playing with prey. "You think your wheelchair gives you some kind of privilege? That I wouldn't dare?" His voice was filled with sarcasm and menace. "I can get you out of here without anyone noticing." The girl, not knowing what to say, clutched at the armrests of the wheelchair. Her fingers, white with tension, treacherously trembled. She felt her whole world crumbling under the weight of his words and actions. The policeman straightened up, holstering his gun back in his holster, but his hand remained on its grip as a warning. He walked around her wheelchair in a circle, as if assessing his victim. His eyes slid over her with disdain, and his mouth stayed open with racist remarks. "You're all the same. You think because you're in those wheelchairs, you should be pitied. You think your lives are worth anything?" He stopped in front of her and leaned in so their faces were level. "You're just tolerated." She tried to looking away, but he slapped his hand sharply on the rail of her wheelchair, making her flinch. "Look at me when I'm talking," he wheezed. "You should know your place." The girl tried to find words to defend herself, but it was as if fear paralyzed her. She looked at him like a monster and could not believe that this was happening in real life. He seemed to enjoy her condition, her silence, her weakness. At that moment, a noise was heard from behind. Someone opened the door of the house and shouted, "What's going on here?" It was her mother. Her voice sounded confident, but she sounded afraid for her daughter. The policeman turned around, his face contorted with irritation, but he kept his hand on his gun. The girl saw her mother walk quickly toward them, her eyes blazing with anger. But the policeman did not move. His gaze slid to the woman and he hissed, "Who are you?" "I am the mother of this girl, and you will remove your hand from your weapon right now," she said, clenching her fists. The policeman only grinned, as if this was just another obstacle he could easily remove. He slowly removed his hand from the holster, but there was a sense of menace in his movements, as if he might return to the weapon at any second. The mother's words rang out in the silence. "You have no idea who you're messing with." But, as yet, none of them knew that this meeting would be the beginning of an event that would change the lives of all who witnessed the scene. The policeman stood towering over the girl in the wheelchair like a rock, his face contorted with contempt. There was a hatred in his eyes that he didn't even try to hide. Her mother, still standing nearby, tried to speak calmly, but every word she said seemed to fuel his rage. "You'd better leave if you don't want trouble," he said, turning his head slowly toward his mother. "I assure you there will be trouble." He turned his attention back to the girl. His gaze slid over her face, her thin arms resting nervously on the armrests of the wheelchair. "People like you," he began, enunciating each word with disgust, "only take resources away from society. Do you know how much tax dollars go to people like you? Have you ever wondered why people like you do nothing but sit on the backs of normal people?" The girl, still holding back tears, felt her eyes fill with moisture. She looked away, trying to avoid direct contact with his piercing eyes, but that only made him more angry. "Look at me when I'm talking," he shouted, slamming his palm down hard on the rail of her wheelchair. A metallic clang echoed through the yard, making the girl's mother wince. "You think sitting in that thing makes you special? Number. You're just a burden to everyone. We work to keep people like you alive." He took a step back and looked her over from head to toe, turning his attention back to the wheelchair as if it were a symbol of everything he despised. "You know what the funny thing is?" he continued with a sneer. "Even if you got out of that wheelchair, you'd still be a nobody. You belong where no one's looking at you. People like you only spoil the picture." "Enough!" the mother shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "You have no right to talk like that." He turned to her with a chuckle. "I don't have the right. I'm the one who decides what's right and what's wrong. I see people like you every day, and believe me, you're no good. Your daughter is just another example of how rotten the system is." His words hit the girl like a whip. She felt her whole world crumble. Her wheelchair, her weakness, her skin color, all of it suddenly became shameful, as if her existence were a mistake. "Tell me, what can you even do?" he asked sharply, turning to the girl again. "What can you do? Do you do anything useful at all?" "No? Then why should I respect you? Why should anyone?" The girl's mother stepped forward, coming between him and her daughter. Her eyes burned with tears, but there was something else in them too. Strength. "You have no idea what you just did," she said quietly, but with a clear threat in her voice. The policeman smirked, leaning back. "Oh, really? What are you going to do? Call your acquaintances? Give it a try. I'm the law around here, and believe me, no one will listen to you because you're a nobody." These words sounded like a final blow. The girl couldn't hold back any longer. Tears rolled down her cheeks, her hands trembled, clutching the armrests of the wheelchair. She felt the smallest and most helpless person in the world. But at the moment when all seemed lost, her mother pulled out her phone and started dialing. The policeman saw this, his face darkened. "And who are you going to call?" he growled, taking a step toward her. She raised her head and answered firmly, "To the one who will show you what the real law is." Her words hung in the air like a harbinger of an impending storm. The policeman tensed, but he did not yet realize the mistake he had just made. The silence in the courtyard had become unbearable. Only a slight breeze rustled through the trees, but even that seemed to fade in the face of the tension that permeated the air. The policeman stepped forward sharply, reducing the already minuscule distance between himself and the girl in the wheelchair. Her mother made a movement as if to shield her daughter, but he raised his hand, causing her to freeze. "Stop. Stay where you are." His voice was cold and threatening. The girl, feeling her breath catch in her throat, looked up at him. She tried to hold back her fear, but her trembling hands betrayed her inner panic. The policeman leaned toward her, his face contorted in a mocking grin. "You want to know how the laws work here?" he said, slowly unholstering the holster. His fingers gripped the grip of the gun with confidence, and he pulled it out. The black metal glinted in the sun, cold and threatening. The girl pressed herself against the back of the wheelchair, her eyes widening with horror. The policeman, as if enjoying her reaction, raised his gun and pointed it at her face. "You think your wheelchair is your shield? You think because you're so helpless, everyone should feel sorry for you? You're wrong. In this world, only the strong have the right to live. People like you don't belong here." His words sounded like a sentence. Someone in the crowd, which had begun to gather at the neighboring houses, gasped. People whispered, but no one dared to intervene. A man with a gun in his hands was too dangerous, and his hatred too obvious. "Look at you," he continued, keeping his gun drawn. "You're just a burden on this society. Why do we need people like you? You do nothing, you give nothing, you're just a waste of resources." The girl's mother couldn't stand it and took a step forward. Her voice shook with anger and fear. Put the gun down. You have no right." The policeman turned his head toward her without putting the gun away. "You're the one who has no right to tell me what to do. Do you realize who I am? I'm the law. And if I need people like her to know their place, I'll do it." He focused his attention back on the girl. Her tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't say a word. Her small hands clung to the armrests of the wheelchair as if it were the only thing that could keep her in reality. "Why don't you say something?" He shook his weapon slightly. "You wanted to be here, in this neighborhood. So answer me. Why do you think you can be here?" At that moment, someone in the crowd shouted out, "Stop it! This has gone too far." The policeman turned sharply in the direction of the shout, his eyes flashing with anger. "Someone else wants to test my patience?" But he didn't notice how the girl's mother seized the moment. She dialed a number on her cell phone and, trembling, pressed the receiver to her ear. Her voice was quiet but firm. "He pointed a gun at my daughter. I need you to come right away." The policeman caught her words and turned to her again. His face was contorted with rage. "Do you think anyone will help you? Do you think anyone will side with the likes of you?" He shifted his gaze to the girl again. "This is your last chance to realize that there is no room for the weak in this world." Silence filled the space again. Only now it was not the silence of fear, but the silence before the storm. The policeman continued to hold his gun, confident of his total impunity. But he did not yet know that cars with blinkers were already speeding out of the courtyard, and his time, as well as his power, was inexorably coming to an end. The door of the house opened abruptly, and the girl's mother ran out of it. Her hair was disheveled and her face was frozen with a look of horror. In her hands, she clutched a cell phone that shook as violently as her fingers. She saw her daughter sitting in a wheelchair and a policeman standing in front of her with a gun pointed directly at her face. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Put the gun down. It's a child." The policeman turned slowly toward her, his face twisted in a mocking grin. He didn't even try to put the gun away. Instead, his fingers gripped the grip tighter, as if he wanted to demonstrate that he was in control of the situation. "Do you even realize who you're talking to?" he asked, his voice filled with venomous contempt. "I'm the law around here, and if I think people like your daughter shouldn't be here, then I'm right." His mother stepped forward, her eyes burning with anger and fear. She held up her hands, trying not to provoke him further. "Please, calm down. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's just a child." "Just a kid?" The policeman laughed, but there was no mirth in his laughter. "It's not a kid. It's a problem. It's an extra mouth we're all feeding. This neighborhood doesn't need her, or this country." These words, filled with hatred, sounded like a hammer blow. The girl sat motionless, her tears streaming down her cheeks, but she could not even raise her head. Every word of this man seemed to tear her soul. "I said, stay where you are," he shouted, waving his hand sharply as the mother took another step toward her daughter. "If you come any closer, I'll show you how the laws work." "You're threatening my daughter." Her voice trailed off, and she pressed her hand to her chest as if trying to stop her heartbeat. The policeman only smirked. "That's not a threat. It's a warning. People like you should know your place." He turned to the girl again, his face contorted with anger. "You think your wheelchair is going to save you? You think that's an excuse to be here? You're no better than the dirt under my feet." Those words made her mother clench her fists. Her anger was growing, but she knew she had to act coolly now. She picked up the phone and, with trembling fingers, began dialing. "What are you doing?" the policeman asked, his eyes squinting. "Calling. Someone who can deal with you," she said firmly, her voice cold. "Make the call," he shouted, waving his gun. "No one will take your side. No one. You know who I am? I'm the one who decides who has the right to live here." His mother looked him straight in the eye. Her fear vanished, giving way to rage. She knew this man was abusing his power, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. The crowd standing to the side began to whisper louder and louder. Some took out their phones, filming what was happening. Some tried to call for calm, but no one dared to interfere. The policeman, sensing the growing attention, turned sharply toward the people. "What are you looking at?" he barked. "Do you want to see how far I can go?" At that moment, my mother finally said, "My father is on his way, and believe me, when he arrives, your career will be over." His face contorted, but he tried to maintain a semblance of control. "And who is he?" he asked with a sneer. "Chief of police," she said, her voice quiet but full of confidence. The policeman froze. For a moment, doubt flashed in his eyes, but he quickly regained his mask. He looked back at the crowd, who were now beginning to videotape him, and felt the control of the situation slipping from his hands. But he was still holding the gun. He was still standing in front of the girl in her wheelchair, who, despite her fear, was beginning to believe that this nightmare would soon be over. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and if you've had something similar happen in your life. Subscribe so you don't miss new episodes and stay up to date with all our stories. And now we continue. The policeman, confident of his superiority, was still in control of the situation. At least he thought he was. His gun was still pointed at the girl in the wheelchair. He was enjoying the moment, feeling himself the master of the situation, not noticing how his actions were going beyond the boundaries of what was acceptable. "Do you think anyone is going to come to your rescue?" He threw at the girl, his voice full of venom. "You are nothing in this world. Neither the color of your skin nor that pathetic wheelchair makes you important." The girl looked at him with eyes full of tears, unable to say a word. Her mother, standing to the side, clutched the phone tightly. Her face was tense, but her movements remained precise. She knew she had the only weapon that could end this nightmare. She dialed the number. "Daddy," she said quietly, but her voice shook with rage. "Come over. It's urgent. This man is threatening my daughter with a gun." On the other end of the line, her father, a man of iron will, known for his intolerance of any injustice, immediately realized that the situation was out of control. "I'm on my way," he replied briefly. Meanwhile, the policeman noticed that she was on the phone. He turned sharply, his eyes squinting. "What are you whispering?" he shouted, taking a step toward her. "You think someone's going to save you?" She raised her head and looked at him with cold certainty. "Yes, someone will save you, and that person will make you regret every word you say." His face creased into a smirk, but a shadow of doubt slipped into his eyes. "Really? And who would that be? A husband? A friend? Or another one of your independent witnesses who think their words mean something?" "My father," she answered firmly, "and he's the chief of police." These words fell like a thunderclap. For a moment there was confusion on the policeman's face, but he quickly regained his mask of equanimity. He laughed loudly, glancing at the crowd. "Oh, the chief of police? Really?" he said with a sneer. "Is that your trump card? You think I'm scared? You think I don't know how these systems work? You're all the same. You think your connections make a difference." But his confidence began to waver. He noticed that people in the crowd started to pull out their phones, filming what was happening. His voice became louder, sharper, as if he was trying to prove something not only to them, but to himself. "I'm still the law here," he shouted, shifting his gaze back to the girl. "And I'm going to make sure you all remember that." The girl's mother continued to stand still, her gaze focused. She was no longer afraid. She knew that help was on its way. The girl, seeing the determination on her mother's face, felt hope spring up in her heart. Sirens could be heard in the distance. Loud and shrill, they were coming faster and faster. The policeman froze. He tried to maintain his arrogance, but his hands trembled slightly, and the gun dropped a few centimeters. "You'll be sorry," he muttered, taking a step back. The sirens grew louder and louder. The people in the crowd began to whisper even more vigorously. Some even began to applaud, anticipating that justice was about to be served. The policeman realized his time was up, but he was still clinging to his power, still trying to prove his superiority. He did not know that he had already become a pawn in a game where his opponent was none other than the chief of police. The sirens of the police cars broke the silence of the street, their blue and red lights reflecting on the houses, dancing anxiously on the walls. The crowd gathered around them froze in anticipation. People knew that something significant was about to happen. Tension had reached its limit. The racist policeman, who had just seemed unshaken, froze for a moment. His face still held a mask of confidence, but his eyes showed fear. He turned as he saw the approaching cars and took a step back, as if realizing that his power was beginning to slip away. A tall man in a strict uniform slowly emerged from one of the first cars. His face was impenetrable, but his gaze was so cold that the air around him seemed to turn icy. This was the local police chief, a man whose name inspired respect and fear even among his subordinates. His reputation as a man intolerant of injustice was known to everyone in the neighborhood. He headed straight for his granddaughter, who was sitting in a wheelchair. Every step he took was measured, but it was powerful. The racist policeman saw him and took another step back. His hand involuntarily let go of the gun he was still holding, and he quickly holstered it. The police chief stopped in front of his granddaughter. His gaze softened for a moment when he saw her crying face, but then his eyes flashed with steely fire again. He turned to the policeman, and his voice sounded as if every syllable was a sentence. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The crowd held its breath. The racist policeman tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His face turned pale, and he began to make excuses, stammering. It's just a misunderstanding, sir. I didn't realize that, You didn't know?" The police chief interrupted, his voice louder and sharper. "Didn't you know you were looking at a child? Didn't you know you were looking at a defenseless girl in a wheelchair? Or didn't you know that your place is to protect, not humiliate?" The policeman opened his mouth to reply, but the police chief stepped closer, his figure completely overwhelming the officer. "You pointed a gun at my child," he continued, his voice lower but even more menacing. "My granddaughter. And that's not just a violation, it's a crime." The policeman lowered his head, his hands trembling. Now his confidence was completely gone. The crowd around him began to whisper louder, and several people shouted, "He must answer for this! Arrest him!" The police chief gestured for his subordinates to approach. Several officers got out of their cars and surrounded the racist policeman. He tried to make some kind of excuse. "This is a misunderstanding. I was acting within the law. She could have been a threat." "A threat?" repeated the police chief, his voice now almost a whisper, but that only made it more frightening. "A girl, in a wheelchair. Is that a threat to you?" He turned to his subordinates and nodded. One of the officers immediately approached the racist and put his hands behind his back, handcuffing him. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of approval. "You can't do that," shouted the racist policeman, his voice becoming hysterical. "I was just doing my job. It was a mistake." The police chief came closer and, looking him straight in the eye, said, "You're right. It was a mistake. Your last mistake on this job." Then he turned to his granddaughter and her mother. His face was soft again, but there was still pain in his eyes. He knelt down on one knee so that he was at the girl's level. "It's over, honey. I'm here. You're in no more danger." The girl was finally able to breathe freely. Her hands, still gripping the armrests of the wheelchair, began to relax. She looked at her grandfather and whispered, "Thank you." The police chief stood up and turned again to the officer who was already sitting in the police car. His look said that this man would answer for everything he had done. The crowd began to disperse, but the sense of justice finally being served remained with everyone who witnessed the event. The police chief knew that this was not the end. He had to make sure that this would never happen again. The police chief stopped at the door of the patrol car behind which the racist officer sat. His hands clutched the handcuffs tightly, as if each iron piece represented the weight of justice that had gone unclaimed for too long. The crowd watched him with reverent silence. People knew they were about to witness something important. "Get out," he ordered, his voice sounding cold and unforgiving. The racist policeman didn't move at first, his face pale, but he was still trying to maintain the remnants of his false grandeur. He looked around the crowd, looking for someone to support him. But instead, all he saw was condemnation and contempt. "I said, get out," the police chief repeated, taking a step forward. The policeman reluctantly complied. He got up from the car, but his gaze was still trying to defy. "It's a mistake," he began, but his voice trembled. "It's all a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." The chief of police stepped closer. His tall figure, stern posture, and icy gaze made the officer instinctively take a step back. "Performing your duties?" he repeated, slowly cuffing one of the officer's hands. "Your duties are to protect people. And you pointed a gun at a child, a girl in a wheelchair. You called her an extra. You humiliated her mother. You threatened a defenseless family. That's your duty?" The crowd erupted into shouts of approval. People began to clap, their applause growing louder as the police chief buckled the other half of the handcuffs. "Do you think that all this will go unpunished as before?" he continued, addressing his subordinate. "But this day is the end of your career and your permissive behavior." The racist policeman tried to twist away, but the police chief held him firmly by the shoulder, guiding him toward one of the cars. The crowd parted, but their gazes stung with judgment, as if thousands of eyes were watching his every move. "That's not true," the policeman shouted, his voice sounding hysterical. "You have no right. Everything was legal." "Legally?" The police chief stopped, turned around, and looked at him with an expression that silenced the policeman. "The law is about justice, not your personal beliefs, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." When the policeman was in the car, the crowd began to shout words of approval. People who had been afraid to speak were now finding their voices. "That's the way to deal with racists. Finally, justice has been served. How many people did he humiliate while he got away with it?" The words filled the air, heightening the sense of triumph. Later, investigations began and the truth about the racist policeman's past came to light. It turned out that complaints had been filed against him repeatedly. People told of cases in which he had insulted people of color, mistreated those who could not defend themselves, and abused his power. Each new detail made his downfall all the more inevitable. Journalists quickly picked up the story, and the policeman's name became a symbol of injustice that had gone unpunished for too long. But this time, public opinion proved decisive. People, tired of such cases, demanded strict punishment. The police chief personally addressed the press, saying, "This man has betrayed the very essence of his job. A police officer should be a protector, not a tyrant. We will not allow someone with such a reputation and actions to remain in the service." Against the background of this statement, a video shot by one of the witnesses appeared. It captured the moment when the policeman pointed a gun at a girl in a wheelchair. The video went viral on social networks, garnering millions of views and comments. "We will no longer be silent," people wrote. "Such tyrants have no place in society." Charges were soon brought against the racist officer. His arrest symbolized the beginning of change. It was not just the end of his career. It was a signal to all those who use their power to humiliate others. The crowd, who had seen everything with their own eyes, left with the feeling that justice was possible after all. And the girl in her wheelchair felt that her voice, her existence, meant more than she had ever realized. The story that took place in that quiet neighborhood stirred up not only the neighbors, but the whole city. The media immediately picked up on the details and headlines began to appear one after another. A police officer threatened a girl in a wheelchair with a gun. Racism in uniform, how abuse of power destroys trust. People who had previously kept silent about injustice felt it was time to speak out. An eyewitness video of a racist police officer pointing a gun at a child has gone viral. Millions of people around the world watch this short but horrifying video, feeling anger and outrage. A flurry of emotion erupted in comments on the post. How could he do that? This man should never have worn a uniform. Thank goodness her grandfather intervened, but what would have happened if he hadn't been there? The girl's mother spoke at the press conference. She was tense, but her voice sounded confident. She described how her daughter, a person who already faces the challenges of life because of her condition, had been humiliated, racially abused, and threatened by someone who was supposed to protect her. "This case is not just an incident," she said. "It is a symptom of a system in which those who abuse their power have been tolerated for too long. We need to change that so that no one else has to go through what we went through." The girl, sitting next to her mother in her wheelchair, was silent, but her presence spoke louder than any words. People saw her and understood the fear she felt when she looked into the muzzle of a gun. Her fragility and strength at the same time became a symbol of the struggle against oppression. Meanwhile, the investigation against the racist policeman was gaining momentum. Details of his service were revealed. Numerous complaints from citizens, accusations of abuse of authority, racist comments made on duty, but each time the system covered for him, until now. The police chief, who personally handcuffed his subordinate, did not stop there. He initiated a major audit of the department to uncover all cases of abuse. His determination drew praise from the public and led to a purge of those who did not meet the high standards of service. When the trial began, the policeman tried to justify himself. His lawyers cited stress, long service, and pressure from work. But the video, the words of witnesses, and the emotional speeches of the girl's mother shattered any line of defense. This man did not just exceed his authority, the prosecutor said in his closing remarks. He abused the public trust, humiliated those he was supposed to protect, and showed by his actions that he did not deserve to wear the uniform. The judge handed down a sentence: several years in prison for threatening life and abuse of office. In addition, the former policeman lost his pension and the right to work in law enforcement. This was a loud signal to all those who thought that the uniform gave them permissiveness. This girl's story has become more than just a case study. It has inspired thousands of people around the world to fight for justice. Petitions for police reforms garnered millions of signatures. People demanded more oversight of officers, stiff penalties for abuse of power, and programs to eliminate racism in law enforcement. The girl's mother said in an interview, "We didn't want to become part of such a story. But if our case helps at least one child not to go through something like this, that's a victory." And the girl, sitting in her wheelchair, no longer felt weak. Her story, her fears and worries became a voice for change. She inspired people to believe that even the most fragile can become strong if the truth is on their side. The crowd that once stood silent now acted. This incident showed that abuse can be stopped if not silenced. And while the story began with horror, it ended with a lesson for all. Power requires accountability, and justice requires the voice of each of us. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your stories and opinions are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Subscribe to our channel, give us a like to support us, and be sure that together we can make the world a better place. We wish you a good and peaceful day.